Hey there nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and we're back in an episode of Cheap Shots, our series dedicated to showing you how to save money on the wargaming hobby. And on today's episode, we'll show you how to paint Thaddeus the Purifier, a character from your games of Warhammer Quest Blackstone Fortress. By following the tips, techniques, and materials that we suggest, you can paint your miniature to a beautiful tabletop standard for less than $23. And when you compare that for materials that you need to purchase from both Army Painter and Citadel, we're going to help you save over $186 at exactly the same time. So if you're looking for a really cheap and a cost-effective way in order to paint up Thaddeus the Purifier, well, tune in because this video is for you. So the first thing we have to do with this miniature, of course, is to assemble it, which will really be simple to do because a lot of the Warhammer Quest miniatures are actually push-fit assembly, which means they just push them together and they assemble very quickly. After you get done assembling the miniature, the next thing you want to do, of course, is to texture the bases. You could use astrogranite to do this, but unfortunately astrogranite costs $7.99 a pot, and I feel much easier using wood glue as well as sand, which I have just lying around the house, which is absolutely free. So what I do is I paint the bases with wood glue, and then I dust them with some sand that I get from my backyard, and I let it dry. And the next thing I do, of course, is create a sealant on top of that texturing. I make a 50-50 mixture of wood glue and water, and I mix it together until it's about the consistency of milk, and I apply it like a wash all over the texturing and let it dry. And what it does, it creates an airtight seal to make sure that the texturing doesn't come flaking off your base. And the next thing, of course, we do is we get a can of Rust-Oleum white flat white primer. You can get this stuff at your local Walmart for about $3.99, and I just give it the once over to get a good priming on the miniature. Primer, what it does, it helps your acrylic paints to adhere to the surface of your miniature. At the same time, the white undercoat will have a huge impact on the vibrancy of the colors that we're using. And the reason why that is the case is because we're going to do a quick paint method on this, meaning we're going to use an oil wash all over the miniature, and that oil wash will darken down the value of the colors. So because that, you having that white undercoat is really going to help out with that brightness. So the very first detail we're working on this character is on the flesh parts of this character, which isn't very much. It's just basically this character's left hand as well as her face. To pick out that detail, we put 2 thin coats of flesh by Apple Barrel paint. You can get this stuff at your local Walmart for about 50 cents, and just put 2 thin coats directly on all the exposed flesh on this miniature, which isn't very much. And of course, once that dries, the next thing we're going to do, of course, is to work on a dry brush. Now we're going to dry brush this character's flesh with Peaches and Cream by Delta Serum Coat. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. It's a beautiful pale flesh color that I like to use for my dry brushing for my characters I use, and just normal flesh tone from Apple Barrel. So I just do a quick dry brushing with that all over the miniature, and what that does, it creates the illusion of highlights as well as depth on the miniature as well. The individual pigments of paint actually adhere to the raised surfaces of the miniature, so that creates that illusion of depth by having that lighter color on the raised surfaces while the darker base coats in the recesses of the miniature. Now you will have a very pastel and chalky finish on these miniatures once you do that dry brushing, but do not stress out because when we get to the oil washing phase, it's going to smooth out those transitions between our base coats as well as our dry brushing, and it's going to look completely smooth. So on this miniature, we're going to change up a little bit. Usually when it comes to the metallic elements, I usually focus that on the end of the miniature, but for this one specifically though, we're going to focus this on it first. And the reason why is because of the head crest this character is wearing. Thaddeus the Purifier is very much wearing like an old Roman Catholic style headdress, like for bishops and stuff, and it has a lot of metallic gold work along that headdress. So we're going to focus on that first because it's going to be much easier to put the metallics down first and then fill in the negative space with the actual fabric color than to do it the opposite direction. So what we're going to do is we're going to pick out the giant Inquisition icon that's on his forehead. We're going to pick down 2 thin layers of Folk Arts Anniversary Silver. It's a nice bright silver that's got a little bit of blue tinge to it. It's going to make it really contrast nicely with the rest of the elements on this miniature. And the next detail we're going to work on real fast is all the gold elements on this head crest as well. There's a lot of scroll work along the ridge and the edges of this headdress, along the top as well as along the brow of the miniature. So we're going to pick out those layers and 2 thin layers of Deco Arts Emperor's Gold. You can get this at your local your Walmart for about 75 cents. It's a beautiful rich golden color, and we're going to focus on the elements on the front of the headpiece. And we're going to do exactly the same thing with the back of the head crest as well. As you can see, there's a lot of gold work right over there as well. And then what we're going to do is we're going to fill in the negative space with Ivory by Apple Barrel paint, and that is the next detail we're going to focus on next. So what we're going to do for this character's robe is we're going to pick those out in details of 2 thin layers of Ivory paint by Apple Barrel paint. And the reason why I like to use ivory is because unfortunately white is a very difficult color to paint. It's because of just the slightest bit of discoloration will ruin the overall finish of any pure white surfaces. So because I like to use one of 2 colors whenever I have to use for white, I usually like to use Ivory by Apple Barrel paint or Pale Gray by Folk Art. In this situation, I want his robes to be a little bit more warmer in color and a little bit more color contrasting than just a stark white contrast to kind of show you that this character is kind of like lived in this outfit and has kind of seen some worn and some wear. So because I use 2 thin layers of ivory paint, I do this for the negative spacing along the top of the head crest as well as the rest of the robes that this character has. And once we're done with that detail, next thing we're going to work on, of course, are the leather goods. So for the next couple of steps, we're going to focus on the leather goods that this character has, specifically things like his boots, for example, as well as the cabling that he has around his body, as well as the skull that he has, because he does have a cervical skull that accompanies him. So what we're going to do is we're going to pick out the things like the respirator tubes along the back of his neck, as well as the book that he's carrying, as well as his boots. We're going to use 2 thin layers of pigment paint by Apple Barrel Paint. It is a really dark gray color, but the reason why I like using that paint so much is because a little bit of a grit texture to it, so when you do dry brushing, it does a beautiful job of catching those pigments and creating that three-dimensional look that we were talking about earlier. You're also going to do exactly the same thing with some of the cabling coming from the servo skull that's hanging right next to him. And speaking of the servo skull, we're going to actually pick out that skull in 2 thin layers of khaki paint by Apple Barrel. You can get this stuff at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. So next thing we're going to do real quick is to dry brush the black elements that we've done earlier, such as his boots, as well as the cabling, as well as the book that he's carrying. Now we're going to do 2 layers of dry brushes on this one. The first layer is going to be pewter gray by Apple Barrel Paint. You get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. As you can see, we bring out a lot of the mid-tones that we can see in there, things like the ridges along the respirator tubes around his neck, as well as the electrical cabling from the servo skull, as well as the general texturing on the book, as well as his boots. We're going to put another layer of dry brushing directly on all the back elements using Pale Gray by Folk Art as well. And the reason why is to add that last additional bit of highlighting on the black materials this character is wearing. Once again, on the boots, the respirator hose along his neck, the back of the book that he's carrying, as well as the cabling on the surface skull as well. And I like using this 3 kind of layered dry brushing technique because it does a beautiful job, especially when you do an oil wash with it as well. So the next major detail we're going to work on as well is on the pages of the book he's carrying as well. We're going to pick that on 2 thin layers of khaki paint, which is the exact same color we use for the servo skull. And the reason why we're using that color is because it's supposed to look like parchment that this guy is writing inside of his book as well. And parchment, in case you're not aware of it, parchment's actually made out of animal hide is actually what it's made from. So it's actually made out from the skin of animals. So I want to create that kind of skinned animal kind of parchment look. And I think that khaki does a beautiful job of doing that. And the last detail we're going to pick, of course, is on the belt that his character is wearing as well. This character has like this utility belt that's got a pistol as well as looks like a giant satchel for the book that he's carrying as well. We're going to pick that out in 2 thin layers of burnt umber. It's a beautiful dark brown color that's made by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. And I'm going to pick out that detail in 2 thin layers. Now, normally I'm supposed to do a dry brush on the leather goods I did for this character, but to be perfectly honest with you guys, I totally forgot to do the dry brushing on the leather goods this guy's have on his back. So I do apologize for that. However, though, it doesn't really make much of a difference, so I'm kind of okay with the fact that I didn't get that taken care of. So next thing we're going to focus on, of course, are some of the more fine elements on this miniature before we actually get to the metallics. And the things we're going to focus on are primarily his clothing, so specifically the ribbons and robes that this character is wearing for the most part. So he does have like this ceremonial kind of pre-scar going on, so because he does have like a scarf that he has around his armor, we're going to pick out those 2 tassels of his scarf in 2 thin layers of Deco Arts Magenta. You get this stuff at your local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. It's a beautiful dark magenta color, and it's going to look like a purple kind of color, especially when you combine that with the oil wash we're going to use, and it's going to look amazing on this character. And the next thing we're also going to do is focus on the trim of this character's robes, specifically his sleeves as well as the shoulder boarding that he has. He's got this beautiful piping along the ridge of his cloak of his robes. So we're going to pick that detail in 2 thin layers of True Red by Anita's acrylic. It's a beautiful red colored paint that I love using from Hobby Lobby that costs about 65 cents. We're going to work on the piping on the sleeves as well as the shoulder boards of his robes, as well as a section that runs down the middle of his robes as well. And we're going to put 2 thin layers of that, and we're ready to move on to our next fine detail. And the last fine detail we're going to work on before we move on to metallic colors, of course, is the crest that he's wearing on his armor in the center of his body. We're going to pick that detail on 2 thin layers of Tahitian Blue by Delta Ceramcoat. You can get this stuff at your local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. I just picked that in 2 thin layers of that for that really pale turquoise kind of color, so that way it contrasts nicely with the gold that's going to be actually used in his armor. And now that we got that last detail picked out, let's go ahead and move on to the metallic colors. So like I said before, this character's got a lot of metallic colors on this guy, so let's go and talk about exactly what we did. So we're going to use a couple of colors. The first one we're going to use is Deco Arts Emperor's Gold for a lot of the gold elements on this guy. So for example, the trim along the armor that he has for his chest piece that he has, that huge honking thing is made out of gold. So because we're going to pick that in 2 thin layers of that color. We're also going to use it for the trim of the scarf that he's wearing with the tassels, as well as the center board that's running down the center of his robes as well. We're going to put those details in that. At the same time, we're also going to use Folk Arts anniversary silver, so for some of the bright silver elements that this miniature has. Things like, for example, like some of the chain as well as the jewelry that he has hanging off of his armor, as well as some parts hanging off the servo skull. We're also going to use antique copper by Anita's acrylic, which costs 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby for things like the little energy pack on the power maul that he's also carrying. We're also going to use gunmetal gray for some of the silver elements that we have in this miniature, like the skull iconography, as well as some of the jewelry pieces on his tassel. And we're going to use copper by Folk Art for the massive head of his power maul that he's also carrying as well. Now, the Folk Art colors would cost you 75 cents at your local Walmart, while the Anita's acrylic costs 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. We're also going to pick out a lot of the gold elements on the back of his armor as well. For example, like the little cross that he has on the back of his little satchel he's carrying there. The same thing with the armor panel that he's wearing on his back as well. We're also going to use the same gold element for the corners of the book that he's carrying, as well as some of the copper elements on the barrel shroud of the weapon that the servo skull is carrying as well. And once we get those details done, the next thing we can work on are some of the finer details on this miniature. So the finer details we're going to focus on the miniature are things like, for example, the tassel of the purity seals that he has. Unfortunately, I forgot to take a picture of the purity seals that he has on the back of his armor, but what we use is Redeco Arts Magenta for the actual wax seal of those purity seals, and we're going to use Territorial Beige for the little scripture that's actually attached to it as well. We're also going to use Green Turquoise. You don't really see this color too well, so I do apologize for this. We're going to use this for the little lens of the servo skull that's right next to him as well, so that way we can pick up that glowing eye detail. And now that we're done with the miniature, the next thing we need to do now is work on the base. So for the texturing on his base, I'm going to put 2 thin layers of Payment's Paint by Apple Barrel Paint. It's going to make this guy match the rest of the Necromunda squad that I have him used for. I'm not going to use this guy so much for Blackstone Fortress. I'm mainly using this guy as like the leader of either a Redemptionist gang or an Inquisitorial gang or a Venator gang or some kind of gang. I'm definitely using him for Necromunda. I'm not using him for Warhammer Quest. So because of that, I'm going to make his base match the rest of our Necromunda miniatures with that Urban Decayed base look that we have. And the next thing we do for his base, of course, is to dry brush it with some pale gray by Folk Art. You can get this stuff at your local Walmart for about 75 cents to create that depth of look on the texturing on the bases. And now that we're done with that miniature, the next thing we need to do, of course, is an oil wash. So when we do the oil wash for this miniature, what we're going to use mid-wax polyacrylic and mission oak, and we're going to thin it down a little bit with some water. The reason why we're going to do that is because I don't want to lose a lot of the vibrancy, especially the robes he's wearing with that mid-wax poly shade acrylic. Now, a lot of people like to use Army Painter Strong Tone. It's a wonderful product, does exactly what it's supposed to, but it costs $32 a can, whereas the mid-wax polyacrylic only costs $6.99 in order for that product. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that oil wash, I'm going to thin it down with some water, I'm going to apply it like a wash all over the entirety of the miniature. So wherever the miniature is, including the base, we're going to paint that oil wash in, and what the oil wash is going to do is going to do a couple things for us. The first thing that it does is going to seep directly into the recesses of the miniature and brings a lot of the details we couldn't see earlier. Things like the texturing and the writing on the book, for example, as well as the scarf that he's wearing, as well as the individual links of the chain, the power hose that he's wearing as well, the folds, the fabric, all those beautiful details we couldn't see before have now been revealed. The second thing that the oil wash does it too is it also smooths out the transitions between our base coats and our dry brushing. So that very pastel chalky texture is now completely gone because those colors have been blended together and those transitions have been smoothed out. And the last thing that the oil wash does as well is it darkens down the value of the colors that we use on this miniature, which is also why I thinned it down with a lot of water, so that way I could also not lose the vibrancy of the ivory color this character is wearing. Now, the mid-wax poly shade does have polyurethane mixed with the stain, so because you do have to wait 24 hours for this stuff to dry and cure, my suggestion to you is to make this the very last step of your painting process, so that way the next time that you come back to your painting, it'll be completely dried and cured by that point. So with that, we have two last steps before this miniature is completed. The first thing we do, of course, is to rim the base of the miniature. I like to use Folk Art Skyline that's made by Folk Art. It costs 75 cents at your local Walmart. I put that 2 thin layers along the rim of the bases because that's the color I use for all the Necromunda miniatures in the studio's collection. And once we do that, the last thing I do, of course, is a matte varnish spray by Crown Matte Varnish. You can get this at your local Walmart for about $5.99. And the reason why I like to do that is so that way I have that matte look and matte finish on the miniature. The polyurethane will give it a high gloss finish, and if you really like that high gloss finish on your miniatures, you could of course skip the matte varnish stage. However, I like a matte finish on my miniatures, so I just spray it down with the Crown Matte Varnish, and then we are completely done. So once again, this is the end result of our character for Thaddeus the Purifier for Warhammer Quest, using our very cheap method of doing so by using some cheap craft paints, which costs us a grand total of $20.73, and that's assuming, of course, you're buying everything for the very first time. Now, when compared that to the Army Painter Citadel method, we're going to save you $163.76. So that being said, let's go ahead and talk about exactly what you'll need to purchase from Citadel as well as Army Painter to paint up your miniature the same way we did, but using those named brand products instead. So these are the materials that you need to buy from Army Painter as well as Citadel to achieve the same result we did, but using their products instead. You'll need to buy Longbeard Gray, Cadian Flesh Tone, Morghast Brown, Baylor Brown, Slaanesh Gray, Eshin Gray, Pink Horror, Flayed One Flesh, Baharoth Blue, Mephiston Red, Rust Gray, Ulthuan Gray, and all of those colors are going to cost you $4.55 a piece, which is anywhere between 7 to 9 times as much as what we're using for our cheapskate method. You also need to buy a pot of Pterodon Turquoise, Wildwood, Aster Granite, Brass Scorpion, Lead Belcher, Screaming Bell, Iron Breaker, as well as Retributor Armor, which costs $7.80 for each of those colors, which are about 10 times as much as their normal equivalent that we're using for our cheapskate method. You also need to buy a can of Corax White Spray, which costs $17.99, which is 3 times more than the flat white primer that we use, as well as a can of Munitorium varnish, which costs $19.50, which costs about 3 times as much as the Krylon matte varnish spray that we use, as well as a can of Army Painter Strong Tone, which costs $32, which is about 5 times as much as the mid-wax poly shade that we use for our method. Now, assuming that you're purchasing everything from Citadel and Army Painter for the very first time, you're talking about a grand total of $186.49, and when you compare that to our cheapskate total of $22.73, we end up saving you $163.76. So there you guys go. This is how you guys can quickly and cheaply paint up Thaddeus the Purifier for your games of Warhammer Quest Blackstone Fortress. So if you're looking for a really cost-effective way of saving money on the miniatures wargaming hobby, might I suggest using cheap craft paints to achieve your objectives of painting up your army, at the same time saving you a ton of money at the same time. I do know that the wargaming hobby is quite expensive, and most of our cost usually goes in miniatures. Miniatures by themselves are expensive enough as it already is. You should not be paying more than what the actual miniature costs in order to paint it. So my suggestion to you is to get cheap craft paints, because it does exactly the same thing and you can save buckets of money at the same time. So that's good to do for this one, you guys. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is invaluable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the latest greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's good for this one, you guys. I will catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.